The measure that we really care about is lifespan in humans, right? Does this ingredient help people live longer? So, but we are trying to create the most scalable, efficient system to answer that question. And so our goal is to create a leaderboard of compounds, meaning here are the ingredients that have the best evidence that they will increase lifespan. We're not saying that they do increase lifespan. We're not saying that the system that we have is perfect. But given the system, if you won't believe the individual data points, we were going to try and combine them into a single composite metric of, evidence. And whether that metric in and of itself is valuable is of course to be debated. And we want it to be debated because we want to improve it. But the idea is you leverage the C. elegans data, the Drosophila data, the Rotarod data, and the human data to come up with a composite, probability that this compound will improve lifespan and, with what effect size, right? So at the end of the day, that's what we want to find is the ingredients that we should be including in an end supplement that, gets sold to consumers.
Hello, Benji. You are the founder of Pump.science, which is a protocol for optimizing longevity. So welcome to Modern Healthspan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to talk to you.
So, Benji, so you have created this platform. Well, actually, you worked at Molecule, which is a platform, and we'll get into that in a bit, which is focused on kind of a new paradigm for how research can be funded and monetized, and maybe more. But before we get into that, what is the problem you're trying to solve? So what's wrong with the current way that research is funded?
Yeah, so I mean, there's certainly a lot of issues with funding that we can get into, right? I think if you break apart the beast that is science funding, you can find a lot of bugs, right? It's definitely an imperfect operating system. But the way I like to think of funding is basically three different pillars. It's the private sector, the public sector, and then individuals, right? And so from the public sector side of things, of course, you're talking about government grants, and there's certainly issues there. You're talking, turnaround times, very low acceptance rates, very little feedback if a grant is not accepted. The kind of overfitting of funding toward whatever the person awarding the grants is interested in and what their motivations are, right? So you basically kind of have a suboptimal system there that's not necessarily market driven, but is completely top down based on whoever happens to be the one making the final decisions, who isn't really incentivized to fund the most impactful research, but fund the most consensus research, right? So I think what you find, and if you look at the data, there's actually there's fewer breakthroughs today than there were years and years ago, where people took greater risk. And I think what one could describe that to a lot of things, but I think the important piece is the incentives of the person who is awarding the grants is not necessarily aligned with us as people, right? The issue with private sector funding is that biotech and biomedical research is just hard. And so the science is very unlikely to produce anything commercializable. And so they must swing for the fences, meaning they must do very, very, frontier research that is likely to result in some sort of blockbuster drug that can, net, billions in dollars per year in sales, right? So that's kind of where the focus is on the private sector side of things. It's on curing diseases that, where insurance will pay for a drug. So that's where a lot of the research funding happens at the private sector. And then comes the individuals, right? And as an individual, you can contribute to a nonprofit But there's a lot of issues with nonprofits as well, that we also don't need to get into. Um, but where we see crypto fitting in here is being a much more pure representation of supply and demand for research. So what I mean there is what you can do with crypto is very, very quickly see where do people want their money going in terms of research, because they can directly exercise their exact wants and needs via buying and selling, right? In the same way that, Facebook kind of captured the internet's preferences with the like button, crypto in the same way captures the internet's preferences with the buy button, right? So the buy button is the new like button, right? And it's basically a way for, the global, humanity to exercise where they want their money going. And, we can represent that in terms of research funding if we offer that as a service. And so really this is the hope that or this is what we hope to bring, to not only the research side of things, but also the crypto, capital markets, is creating a more efficient intersection of supply and demand for biomedical research.
Is it just funding? You're also looking after the IP as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. But the IP is simply a piece of this whole, new funding paradigm, right? So there's lots of applications of blockchain toward improving how research gets done, but we think funding is the most glaring and obvious use case to start with. And so the question is, okay, if you're funding research, what do you get back in return? Is it a donation, right? Are you buying like equity? And I think what we have discovered is that the optimal vehicle for funding is the intellectual property that's created from that research. So what we're in the business of is tokenizing, basically creating a token out of intellectual property. And so this may seem esoteric, but it's actually quite simple legally. What you can do in contract law is, you have a contract that captures the IP, right? IP is just some intangible rights that a government gives you, right? They grant you a patent. They protect your right to commercialize a discovery. What you can do with those rights is you can assign them to anyone or anything. And so what we do is we assign them to cryptographic tokens. And so all that means is it's like one simple legal agreement called an assignment agreement. And what that does is it assigns all legal rights to the holders of tokens. So rather than, let's say, I think the closest comparable here is equity, right? So you may hold a share in a company in the same way we have tokens that represent, fractional, ownership and governance over the intellectual property. So rather than financializing a company, we are financializing a research program in kind of like a distributed way. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And we'll probably come back to that. But I think we need to cover a bit more, a few more basics. So one thing is I think that perhaps people are now becoming more interested as well in their own health. I mean, there seems to be like a switch where people are not accepting that you just go to the doctor when you're ill and get a pill after a 5-minute consultation. So do you see that this is also helping, that there is more interest in longevity?
I definitely think so. I think it's a movement and a rising tide that's going to raise all ships in this field. And the more people care, the more they will hopefully put their money where their mouth is, and realize that there's very little research being done on longevity and help to fund this research, which is super impactful. What we're trying to wake up people's eyes to is, just because a scientific question is important does not mean that science has answered that question. So specifically, like, what should we be taking every single day that helps us live longer and healthier is an important scientific question. I would say you'd probably, I would hope, agree. But it doesn't mean the scientific or medical apparati have answered this question. And the reality is that they haven't really. And so um, our hope is that, like you said, this increased awareness and frankly care into our individual health will hopefully stimulate more people to, fund this research and propel it and manifest it where the existing funding bodies have failed.
So one other kind of area, so there is DSci, right? So distributed science, and something called VitaDAO. So VitaDAO is an example or an implementation of distributed science. Could you kind of explain what those two are?
Absolutely, with pleasure. So there are different entities that you can tokenize. And when I say tokenize, again, it just means like you launch a token, which is, basically a cryptocurrency, right? Bitcoin is a token, Ethereum is a token, Solana, Sol are tokens. And what these basically are, bits of code that represent partial ownership over something. The question is, what is that something? And so what VitaDAO has done is basically tokenize kind of a nonprofit that funds longevity research. So historically speaking, if you're part of a nonprofit, you donate your money to their cause, and then there's kind of like a board who decides where all that money goes. So what VitaDAO does that's a little bit different is they allow people to purchase tokens in the nonprofit and then use that token to vote where the money goes. So rather than have it be, completely top down determined by a select few individuals, anyone who wants to go and buy the Vita token can go and vote on proposals of where to allocate the money. So it's a much more transparent way to basically allocate funding for, a not any group that wants to fund a particular mission, so to speak. So that's what VitaDAO is doing. I hope that makes sense.
Yes. So distributed science, right? So the idea of distributed science is everything is on a blockchain. Everything, all the results as well as the data, as well as the actual experiments, like everything is publicly available. Is that correct?
So there are different implementations for how the data is generated and distributed. What the decentralized science space is focused on primarily is decentralized funding, and that happens on the blockchain, right? Because that's where all the tokens are stored. That's like basically the ledger of who owns how many tokens, what did they vote on, etc. The data is a completely different animal, right? How that gets generated and distributed. As of right now, we are not innovating on how the data distribution happens besides just making it open source, right? So, because the funding is kind of open source, so to speak, it's not done by, private investors. Um, the data itself is just like put out there in the open. And so this is probably a stepping stone to a world in which, you need to hold the token or be a part of, the funders in order to see the data, right? Because you want to kind of like give value to the token holders. So you can imagine a world in which you can only see the data if you contribute it to that project. And so there's a lot of different potential implementations here. And our goal is to actually find the one that works the best. I don't think we particularly are tied to any one model, which is completely open source, token gated data or, completely encrypted data as well. whatever generates the most research funding and pushes the field the furthest. But there is, to your point, like design space here, right? Both on the funding side and the data side. So how projects get funded and how is that data then distributed? There's lots of potential implementations here, and we're experimenting with everything, frankly.
Right. Yeah, I mean that absolutely makes sense. I just didn't think like blockchain would be actually a good place for storing large quantities of data.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not, and frankly, that's why we haven't really done it because it's still clunky. It's a great tool for um, counting value and for sending around tokens and looking at ownership. But in terms of saving data, accessing it, distributing it, it's basically like, you know, it's worse than, some of the worst databases that are used today. It's incredibly slow, incredibly high latency, just very like non-performant from a data perspective. And it's another big reason why we haven't invested too much into that because it's a worse user experience. But funding via crypto is certainly a better experience than using banks and having to run bank wires and pay, $30 in fees to transfer money and, use a credit card and, they have to get it like so much goes behind the scenes, like in terms of a credit card payment and, with all of the fees that are always put on top of it, blockchain kind of drives these transaction costs to zero. So from and it's becoming faster and faster. So from that perspective, it's actually a superior user experience on the funding side. On the data side, definitely worth experience just from an engineering perspective. So yeah, again, that's kind of why we haven't spent too much time there quite yet.
Did you know that over 80% of the population is deficient in magnesium, a mineral involved in over 600 biochemical reactions? And there are 7 forms of magnesium, each with distinct physiological targets. That's why I take Magnesium Breakthrough from Bioptimizers. It's the only full spectrum formula with all 7 forms. Chelate for muscle recovery, citrate for arterial health, bisglycinate for digestion, malate for energy production, sucrosomial for immune function, taurate for cardiovascular health, and orotate for metabolic optimization. Clinical research confirms that organic magnesiums like citrate and malate have higher bioavailability than the common oxide form found in most supplements. It's fascinating how different forms target specific tissues. For example, taurate, malate, and citrate offer neurological benefits, which have helped me with calmness and focus, not to mention improving my sleep quality. If you want to try Magnesium Breakthrough, go to bioptimizers.com/modern and enter promo code modern10 to get 10% off any order. And if you subscribe, not only will you get amazing discounts and free gifts, you will make sure your monthly supply is guaranteed. Okay, so you were a molecule before, right? So do people need to understand molecule to be able to understand what Pump.science does?
I think so. And
Okay.
so, but I kind of already described it earlier,
Right.
where the main innovation that Molecule has brought forward is this tokenized intellectual property um, primitive and token. Um, and what that allows you to do is basically it's kind of like a legal and technological merge that allows basically the bridging of real world intellectual property onto the blockchain, right? So you can think of it about it as like a portal, from the real physical world into the digital world of intellectual property. That's kind of how I think about it. And so now you've basically digitized real world rights, and that's what Molecules technology enables. It's quite powerful. And the question is, what do you do with that? Once you have the power to tokenize intellectual property and digitize it and trade it over the internet, how do you optimally leverage that? And so the thinking with Pump.science is, well, you fund things that you otherwise couldn't in the outside of crypto. And so we see that as like, longevity research is a super interesting application. There is some but not enough research into what we should be taking every day that helps us live longer, right? This kind of like basic, you can call it supplement research. Um, this the way I think about it is if you go onto Drug Age, which is basically this open source repository of lifespan data, there's like less than 2,000 compounds that have been tested for lifespan on any organism that's published. It's a crazy small number, especially when you compare it to there's 325,000 natural products and 30 something billion synthetically accessible compounds. And yet we've tested just over 1,000 for lifespan on any animal. And most of them are, excuse me, C. elegans. So our goal is to increase these numbers via this whole crypto funding mechanism. So we want to tokenize the intellectual property associated with any compound that could be tested. And let basically crypto traders and longevity enthusiasts fund the research that they find interesting and basically test these different compounds on animals, measure their lifespan, and report the data back in a completely open way. And basically fund all of the research through this whole basically this trading process. So it can get into the mechanics if you'd like, but the basic idea is you launch a token for a particular compound, anyone can submit it. And so we just had a conversation with Brian Kennedy's lab in Singapore. And so the idea is for the members of their lab to submit new compounds for testing. They struggle to get funding for some of their research, and they certainly have more ideas than they have funding to test those ideas. And so the idea is they submit a compound that they think could increase lifespan in animals, including humans. And we help them create a token for those compounds. And people trade that token. And through the trading fees, the research gets funded. So basically, every time someone buys or sells the token, a small fee is taken. Over time and with a lot of trading, those fees can add up. And we allocate those fees to go actually run experiments at various different labs for lifespan on different animals.
So somebody requests that a token gets created for a particular molecule. Who decides yes or no? How is that decision made?
A great question. It's the market, right? It's this amorphous, group of, people on the internet who have money who determine what gets funded or not. And so what a scientist essentially does is, yes, a token gets created, but really all they're doing is requesting an experiment. So, this may be a credible scientist who says, I think that this compound should be tested, right? And a token is created as a byproduct of that. And then people can, come to the site, see who submitted the compound, see that it's a credible scientist, and, basically diligence, try and better understand whether that compound has promise. And if they think it does, they buy the token. And if they don't, they don't. But enough funding has to be acquired in order to run the experiment. So there are no gatekeepers per se. The only gatekeeper is this market that determines what gets funded and what doesn't. But it's completely decentralized.
Right. Okay. So anyone can create a token, but if you have no credibility, then it's just going to sit there. Now, when you create the token, does it create a certain number of coins? And when the coins are bought, does that revenue also go towards the project, the study, or is it only the trading fees?
So it's a great question. Our goal is to completely fund all the research with trading fees. That's how we've designed the system currently. But to answer your previous question, yes, 1 billion tokens are created. And those are basically issued in various markets. And we don't need to get into the specific of how those markets work. but really it's quite simple. It's all just code that, creates the token, issues the token, prices the token based on how many have been purchased. But the idea is once the market cap or basically value of a token reaches a certain threshold, then you've received enough fees from trading in order to fund, the first experiment, which for us is C. elegans. So we're testing compounds with Aura Biomedical, which is a biotech company based in, it's a spin out of Mac Paperline's lab. And so they run the first experiment, and all of the funding they get is from the trading fees. And then, yeah, the idea is if more trading fees are collected, then you can afford the next experiment, which is flies. And then following, right now, we're testing on mice as well. So the goal is to not have it be crowdfunding based, but rather be completely trading fee funded. And the reason for doing this is because this is becoming the norm in crypto markets. So rather than, collect 90% of the funding that's been given and leave 10% in the market, we're trying to keep as much as possible in the market and take as little as possible out of the market for funding the research. So what this requires is just attention and trading volume. So a lot of traders trading the token in order to fund the research. And what this does from a trader's perspective is it keeps the probability of making your money back much higher, right? If 90% of the funding that's acquired goes into to fund the research, then that means there's only 10 cents on the dollar that's left for people to get their money out, right? But if we only take a small fraction, then the odds of the casino, so to speak, are higher. And that's what we want to preserve, because that is essentially our competition. We are competing with, the meme coin trading, right? And so, any other token that's being traded in crypto, we are essentially competing with for attention. So there are certainly more traders who just, follow the money, so to speak, than there are longevity enthusiasts who are there specifically to fund longevity research. And so the average user of our platform is not a, longevity first, crypto second. It's the contrapositive, right? So that's really how we've designed the system, is to, kind of compete in the, crypto trading universe for funding, but of something more substantial than doggy coins.
So do you get, yeah, do you get a lot of these coins created? I mean, whose job is it? Because one thing that I see is I create this coin. Well, how does anyone know, right? I mean, unless that you happen to go to Pump.science and look. So is it my job to market it? I guess it is, right?
It's a great question. And really, that question is the essence of this whole system, which is, credibility and attention drive purchasing behavior and drive funding. And so, yes, if you created this token, you have to get people to find it, right, and know about it. And the question of how to do that is, like you said, they can either come to our site, but there's a small probability that they'll see some random compound and be like, oh, this is worth buying. So it would kind of be Richard's job, or somebody who Richard contracts to help them, to go and then market that token, right? And specifically market the science behind the token, right? And lend credence and credibility and, generate excitement about what Richard has created. And so that's really where we believe everything will bottom out. And it's how existing issuers of tokens basically get people to come and buy, is just by going on Twitter, going where the people are, especially the crypto traders, and announcing that they have created this token. It represents this compound. This compound has promise for improving longevity for X, Y, and Z reasons, and therefore is worth further study. But at the end of the day, this is not so dissimilar to how supplement companies market their products, right? It's quite similar. You go on social media, you try and get people's attention in the feed and say, hey, come buy my supplement. It works for X, Y, and Z reasons. It's just that, rather than doing so at the product stage, you're doing so at the research stage. But at the end of the day, it's really the same exercise.
Right. The only, or not the only, but an issue I would see with that is just the disparity in the markets. Like the people who have heard of like Brian Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy, and the people who are willing to buy tokens are probably separate people.
They are separate people. But I think what you find is the traders are quite intelligent and they can go look at Brian Kennedy's Twitter
Mhm.
page, see that he has tens of thousands of followers, and say, oh, Brian Kennedy can drive attention.
Right.
Ultimately, what a lot of these traders are trying to predict is attention. And so followers are a leading indicator of attention, right? And so they're quite intelligent. They can see who has reputation as measured by, these metrics like followers. In a lot of ways, in the crypto world, followers is like H index for academics, right? And so that's who they lend credibility to. And that's who drives purchasing behavior is the people with a lot of followers who can basically, drive people to buy certain tokens. And so it's basically what's funny is it's really the same thing, but we just use different numbers to measure importance. But at the end of the day, it's just a numbers game, and the traders are quite smart, is what you find.
Okay. Okay. So you started talking about how the actual experiments were done. What I mean is what experiments were done, right? You said you started off with worms. So what what is the progress? What experiments are done? What's the progression? How do things move from kind of one level to the next level?
Absolutely. So right now we have a four level process, so to speak. It's C. elegans, then flies, then mice, then humans. Those are kind of our four levels. And so what enables a compound to progress from basically nothing to C. elegans is funding driven. So um, as long as the compound is non-toxic, like known to be not like non-hazardous essentially, then we'll test it on the C. elegans. We will of course not test things that are going to be harmful to the animals that we have evidence will be harmful, right? So things like ivermectin, we will not be testing on worms, right? So um, as long as there, it's non-hazardous, we'll test it, and as long as it got the funding necessary, we'll test it. Then the data gets generated, right, from the C. elegans data. So long as the compound does not significantly reduce lifespan. So as long as it's non-toxic as measured by the C. elegans experiment, and it got enough funding for the subsequent experiment, it will be advanced.
Yeah.
So those are basically the two checks that we run, non-toxicity and sufficient funding. And so then it advances from a Drosophila experiment, or from C. elegans to Drosophila flies. So for the fly experiment, we are doing two things. We're doing longevity, so basically testing the lifespan and seeing does the compound significantly increase lifespan at a particular dose. We're only testing one dose, and really this is around, cost efficiency. But the second thing that we're testing for is motility. So we're running what are called negative geotaxy tests. And what these are basically like, typically you keep the flies in tubes. And so if you slam the tube to the ground, all of the flies fall to the floor of the tube. And flies have a natural response to climbing to the top of the tube if they're slammed to the ground. It's an instinctive reaction. And so we leverage this to see their level of health and fitness. So once per week, they get tested where, via this negative geotaxy assay slam them to the ground, they run to the top, and we use computer vision to measure their speed and distance traveled. Um, so yeah, basically all of the monitoring is done via computer vision. So it's all automated tracking with cameras. And what this does is it allows us to capture a lot of data points on the flies throughout their lifespan. But what it also allows us to do is create an entertaining, spectacle for the traders once per week. So once per week, we record these. We call them fly races, and you can go to our website and you can see some of these fly races if you want. Um, but yeah, like we've basically gamified predicting the outcomes of these assays. And so I think what you can very quickly see is the gamification is an attempt to bring attention to the research. And we can leverage that to generate more funding. So by making it fun, we hope to bring more funding, essentially. That's basically the whole idea of this system. You can look at it as blockchain, you can look at it as tokens and these different experiments and data. At the end of the day, we're trying to make a game that people intrinsically enjoy playing and make it fun to engage in longevity experiments. Anyway, so,
So,
apologies for the sidetrack.
yeah, I wondered whether you could identify individual flies and you could bet on the flies. It's like, my fly's going to
Absolutely.
win.
We've really thought about that and naming the flies, and you basically pay to name them. And anyway, we've
Okay.
thought about all these things. It's a great idea. It's a great idea. I think we're trying to take it step by step. So yeah, after the flies, again, if they don't significantly reduce the lifespan of the flies, and there's sufficient funding, then we advance the compounds to Rotarod testing in mice. We believe, I mean, and what we have been advised by a lot of longevity scientists is we need to test on mammals. The problem is mice testing is extremely expensive. If you look at like the interventions testing program, they're spending about $1 million per compound tested. It is very significant. It is likely more than we could ever afford from this system. It's not impossible that we could get that much, but we don't see it being very scalable. And so what we're trying to do is find a test on mammals that is much more cost efficient. And what we have landed on that is scientifically valid, relatively inexpensive, relatively short term, and relatively entertaining is Rotarod testing on mice. So those are kind of our criteria that we're looking for in an experiment. Because if it's too expensive, we can't afford it. If it's too long, then we lose the attention. If it's scientifically invalid, then what are we doing? Like, what's the point? And if it's not entertaining, then no one will watch it. And if no one watches it, no one funds it. So that's kind of how we landed on Rotarod testing. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but basically it's a metal rod. You put the mice on top. You dose some with the compound and you dose some with control, and the rod accelerates. So it's basically a measure of endurance. Indirectly, it's kind of a measure of VO2 max, but it's more of like a health span measure than like a lifespan measure. But it's still a valuable data point. And we've been advised that, this is definitely a valid approach. So that's the mouse experiment. And then
So
the
one
final
thing,
is humans.
yeah. But a bit more detail on the mouse one. So how old are these mice, and how long do they take? Is this like something you do every week, or is it you do it once a month, or how often do you do it, and how long after you started dosing the mice?
Yeah, so we are getting aged mice. So I believe it's like 76-week old mice. C57 mice is what we've started with. Um, but as far as I understand, the Het3 mice are certainly like a better model. Certainly open there to modifying those different parameters. But the way it works is we do a single baseline at about 76 weeks old. And that gets, kind of your baseline measurement of performance on the rotor rod. It also acclimatizes the mice to the assay. And then over a period of 8 weeks, we measure their performance. So every like 5 days per week, Monday through Friday, they're dosed with gavage, with either compound or control. And then, so that's 5 days a week. And once a week, they are tested on the Rotarod and we, measure their performance. So it's basically a weekly spectacle. And also, yeah, a weekly assay. And yeah, we do that for 8 weeks. So from 76 weeks to whatever that is, 80, 84 weeks. So they're middle-aged mice. And the idea here is you have two counteracting forces. Number one is you actually have a few. You have the effect of the drug, you have the effect of aging, and you also have the effect of them becoming more fit, right? And getting better and better at the assay. So, our goal is to see which compounds result in an outsized, improvement over baseline performance in aged mice. Because as far as we've been told, haven't exactly looked in the data myself personally, but what we've been told is if you take young mice and give them the Rotarod test, the compounds that will improve their performance the most are stimulants, right? And of course, we're not just trying to test stimulants. We want to see what actually reverses the aging phenotype. So that's that's why we structured the assay as we did.
Yeah, no, that will make sense. Yes, I'm sure what keeps a young mouse on there is different from what keeps an old mouse.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah. Okay, so then humans, what are you thinking about for humans? And has anyone got to humans yet?
No, we haven't gotten to humans yet. And
Okay.
there's certainly, as you can imagine, like a lot more logistical challenges around human testing. So, yeah, we've not gotten there yet. But here's what we envision. And certainly it's if you ask two longevity scientists, you get 200 answers of how we should structure this. But the idea is the most distributed biomarker of longevity that is predictive of lifespan is VO2 max. So VO2 max is basically, a measure of cardiorespiratory fitness, and it is highly, highly correlated with all-cause mortality. And also, many people can basically measure their VO2 max with a wearable. And so there are very few longevity biomarkers that are as distributed as VO2 max. And the best part about using this is, yeah, it's very low cost to capture. There are, of course, many different blood-based assays or other functional assays you could test, right? You could test biological age via one of these methylation tests. You could test, a bunch of different, like, weightlifting, power output, et cetera, tests of health span. You can also measure lifespan. All of these have issues associated with them. But we find VO2 max to be like a very comprehensive assay that is highly distributed and will enable us to scale human testing the most. At the end of the day, we're in the business of decentralized science. There is no more decentralized biomarker of longevity than VO2 max. And so that will basically be the primary endpoint, so to speak, of our testing. But the benefit of using wearables data is you also get, sleep data. You get heart rate, heart rate variability, resting heart rate, max heart rate, et cetera. So we can test all of these secondary endpoints as well. But really, like we're open here. If we develop confidence that, some of these aging clocks are, dropping cost and increase in predictive power or demonstrate predictive power over all-cause mortality, we'll certainly, take a look and potentially design the human studies to leverage those endpoints. But as of right now, nobody has given us a better idea of what we should be testing humans for than VO2 max.
Okay. So then I would take one of these compounds, we would see whether it changes my VO2 max on its own, right?
Correct.
Without my changing my exercise. Okay.
Well, if you did change your exercise, we could normalize for that as well.
Right.
So there's of course placebo effect and Hawthorne effect, both of which that would probably affect the results. And so yeah, our goal is to normalize for those effects, given the data that you can also get from a wearable.
Okay. So all right. And when it got to humans, there would also be placebo. So you would be delivering placebos to people.
Either placebo or a dose dependent study.
Right.
So like a range finding study essentially. So as far as we can tell, it's very difficult. It's much more difficult to enroll for voluntary studies if there's a placebo group, but it's much easier to enroll for voluntary studies if everyone gets at least some dose of the active ingredient that's being tested. So, rather than doing placebo controlled, we may just do like low dose, medium dose, high dose, et cetera.
Okay. But so you're still going to need to get whatever it is, ethical approval or whatever for all of these experiments. So at least for the animal experiments, can you just get the principle for these are the experiments we're going to do? I assume for humans, you'll have to get ethical approval each time.
We already do that for the mice. So each mouse experiment goes through an ethics committee, and we'll absolutely do that for the humans as well.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm sure you have to. Yes. Okay. So the end goal is to be able to say this supplement, this dose of this supplement improves VO2 max, and so therefore will probably improve lifespan. Is that the
That
end,
is the idea.
or would you want to kind of go beyond that?
I mean, of course, we would want to go beyond that. We'd want to measure lifespan in humans, right? That's the
Right.
ultimate metric that we
Yeah.
care about. Everything else is a surrogate. All the animal testing is a surrogate. Even the human VO2 max testing is a surrogate. The measure that we really care about is lifespan in humans, right? Does this ingredient help people live longer? So, but we are trying to create the most scalable, efficient system to answer that question. And so, our goal is to create a leaderboard of compounds, meaning here are the ingredients that have the best evidence that they will increase lifespan. We're not saying that they do increase lifespan. We're not saying that the system that we have is perfect. But given the system, if you won't believe the individual data points, we were going to try and combine them into a single composite metric of evidence. And whether that metric in and of itself is valuable is of course to be debated. And we want it to be debated because we want to improve it. But the idea is you leverage the C. elegans data, the Drosophila data, the Rotarod data, and the human data to come up with a composite, probability that this compound will improve lifespan and, with what effect size, right? So at the end of the day, that's what we want to find is the ingredients that we should be including in an end supplement that gets sold to consumers. So at the same time that this is a research and development pipeline, the end goal is to create useful products for people that help improve their lifespan. So as you know, there's a ton of companies in this space. We would like to play in it as well. And because we believe in this system and we believe that with this kind of decentralized funding mechanism, we'll be able to generate all this valuable data that not only helps us pick the best ingredients, but helps generate confidence and trust in the ingredients that are being included. As you know, there's a massive problem in the supplement space of transparency and trust. And so, and rightly so, frankly. Like if you go onto Reddit and you talk to the biohacking community, they're incredibly, and like the longevity community, they're incredibly skeptical, and for good reason, because so much of the data is not put out there. And frankly, like what gets me so excited about this system is we can back up everything we say with open data. There's nowhere to hide. We want it to be all out there, and we want people scrutinizing it. And we think that that'll be a net benefit to the entire longevity community, and hopefully create products that that benefit us and increase our lifespan.
So who would you look to create the products? Because I mean, that's one of the issues, right? So let's take NMN, but I mean, so NMN is not proven to be actually that good, but it doesn't matter. So the NMN, but a lot of the NMN on Amazon was shown to have zero NMN in it, actually. I mean, so it's not just does the molecule work; it's the quality of the actual supplement. So there's two components in there. But would you be making would you start a company to make the product, or would you'd look to the people who did the work, or how would that work? Or yeah.
It's a great question. Our preference would be to partner out our discoveries to establish brands that are in the business of developing supplements, right? They're experts, they're professionals. They've done all the legwork to, build a customer base, and yeah, and that in and of itself is like a huge task. It's a huge hill to climb, of developing a trusted consumer brand. And so ideally, we would just partner our discoveries with them and focus on, the science and the funding components of it. That being said, if no brands are willing to work with us, then we'll have no choice but to develop our own. But ideally, just because of the expense and extra work and labor required to build one of these consumer brands, yeah, we would prefer not to do it, and rather license our discoveries to those existing brands. But if we have to, we will.
Okay. So, which the licensing brings me to another thought. So, product A or molecule A gets to the end, it increases VO2 max. We want to sell it we want to sell it, so we partner with someone, and so they license it from us. So who is us? Is it the holder of the coins?
Exactly. And now you understand the value.
Right.
Exactly. So if they want to license it, all of the token holders get to determine the terms of the license. And whatever value exchange happens there is basically decentrally voted on by the token holders. And they can decide what are the terms, and whether they want to accept those terms. So of course it can get extremely complicated, but the idea is to have very, very standard templates for licenses that, where there's basically a few parameters that could potentially change, but make it as easy as possible for this licensing to occur.
And then the money comes in and just gets distributed among the coins evenly.
Whatever the token holders decide. So we have to be careful about what we say here, but it's whatever the token holders decide.
Okay. I mean,
you would assume that they would act in their own economic self-interest. That's right. Basically what we are trusting is that token holders will act in their economic best interest.
Okay. Have you thought about best case, what the time scale would be to get to that point?
So assuming that an existing brand is excited about the studies we're running, trusts the data, and is willing to use the evidence that we have generated to justify inclusion of the ingredients we test in their end products, then the timing is as follows. The C. elegans experiment takes about 6 weeks to run. So you're about a month and a half there. The fly experiment takes about 2.5 months to run. So now you're at what, 1.5 plus 2.5 is 4 months. The Rotarod test takes about 8 weeks. So let's call it 2 months. So now you're at 6 months. And then the human testing in an ideal setting would hopefully take 4 months. So, ideally, you could go end to end in less than a year. We don't think it's completely infeasible. There's another question of what do you do about compounds that are not generally regarded as safe or can be included in supplements? And for that, there will be more testing required, GRAS testing in the US. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in other parts of the world. In the EU, there's definitely like clinical studies you have to run in order to justify a new, dietary ingredient being included into a supplement. But for compounds that are already designated as supplements, our goal is to, keep it under a year if we can.
Wow. That would be really quick. Yeah.
And really this is what we hope crypto can solve, is if you can make the funding as fast as possible, the rate limiting step becomes the research. And then you have to look at what research is necessary and sufficient to bring an ingredient to market. And it is our belief that can all be done in a year. But we'll see. Proof will be in the pudding.
Yes. So which molecules are currently in process in Pump.science?
Yeah, so we've tested a few. The first two that got tested are rifampicin, which is an antibiotic. We could never develop that as a supplement. But the data is actually fairly interesting, at least in C. elegans for rifampicin. It's a prescription antibiotic. I think the most common indication is actually leprosy and like tuberculosis. But yeah, we can't be giving that chronically to people. One of the other compounds we tested first was urolithin A, which is incredibly interesting, and the data is super strong for, and we're really excited about. Other compounds we're testing are artemisinin, gossypol, catechin hydrate, and what else? EGCG and sulforaphane. So random ingredients, from various natural sources, where we want to test and see, do they have an effect on lifespan? So really the idea is for anybody to be able to submit one of these compounds and let the data determine, what is worth including, what is the biggest bang for buck from a lifespan perspective, and that's what we'll, hopefully, create IP around and license to supplement manufacturers, or, if we must, like develop our own consumer brand that includes these ingredients.
Okay, but most of the ones like EGCG and sulforaphane are already, they already have supplements out there. So
Totally.
I'm not sure what but I don't know much about IP. I know like urolithin A is a natural product, but the Swiss company that came up with it has patented it for something. So
yeah, so Amazentis patented a particular formulation that they call MitoPure, and they've done a ton of clinical studies on MitoPure. Props to them. Super interesting clinical research that they've done, but it is for their particular formulation. There are lots of other, generic urolithin A supplements that you can get. I think the differentiator here is, yes, somebody can go and buy each of those individual ingredients and take a million different pills. But the benefit that we hope to bring is a single product that combines all of these ingredients in a bulk ordered way that actually brings down the cost lower than what it would cost for them to, get each one of those ingredients individually.
Okay. So what what do you see in the future for for Pump.science?
Really, it's just increasing the scalability of this entire system. Like I said, there's only been, just over 1,000 compounds tested for lifespan. If we can make a meaningful dent in that number, I think that will be super interesting and hopefully get the attention of the longevity community. Also, we want to make interesting discoveries, right? We want to make findings that others haven't before. So, at the end of the day, this is much more than just crypto and tokens. We want to actually, those are simply a means to make new scientific discoveries. And so, I think we are one of the first groups to discover that urolithin A increases the lifespan of Drosophila. So, that hadn't really been published yet. We're in the process of writing that up as a preprint right now. So really the goal is to publish as much as possible to make longevity discoveries that actually benefit the ecosystem. And then the goal is to develop the best product on the market that has the best evidence for lifespan extension. Really, we believe that this pipeline can be leveraged to generate the best product, and we want to do our part in just commercializing the discoveries as well, right? Not just making them, but also commercializing them. And really, I think at the end of the day, people care about the human data, and so really we have to run those human studies to get legitimacy and also confidence of the longevity community. So really that's this whole system is for naught if we don't get it into humans. So yeah, those are really the important pieces, I think, of this project being successful, and that's what we're committed to doing.
So, and how old is Pump.science? I mean,
We're about 8 months old,
that's
so we launched in September 2024.
right. Okay, so I mean, it's a good start, right? For 8 months. Just one thought. So rapamycin is currently the best mouse mammal model for longevity. Do you think rapamycin helps with the Rotarod test? If you put rapamycin through your system, would it improve things?
I'm sure that has been done before, but I have not seen the data in order to answer that accurately.
Right.
But can look that up right after. But yeah, I don't want
Yeah.
to make a conjecture and
Yeah.
be wrong. But
Yeah.
my guess is that study has been run before, and I think it's a great question and would be super interested to see whether it does.
Yes. And I wonder whether it improves VO2 max because there are people who take it off label.
Yeah. Should we put AI to the test?
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, Matt Caberline has run this study. Um, and actually it leads to frailty and reduced coordination in the mouse strains that he tested and does not improve lifespan extension. Excuse me, it does not improve Rotarod performance. So to answer your question, no, it does not seem to improve Rotarod performance.
Okay. Which would be interesting because then it would seem that rapamycin wouldn't make it through your gates. But that,
Totally, totally. But again, like these are all metrics that are tested individually, meaning it likely would show improvement on the C. elegans. It would likely show improvement on the Drosophila tests. It may not, show an improvement on the mice, but still there would be some evidence in this end composite metric that it does improve, that it has the chance to improve longevity in humans. So hopefully we can capture some of the signal with some of the experiments, and acknowledging that we are going to lose some signal based on the design decisions that we've made. Again, it's not perfect, but our goal is for scalability.
yes. And that's certainly there's certainly a lot of benefit to that, to like scalability and speed over
Mhm.
perfection, because at the end of every study says more research has to be done. It's like nobody ever
Exactly.
makes
Of course it does.
nobody ever
I'm
finishes anything. Yeah,
yeah, we're trying to not let perfection be the enemy of good, if that's the right quote.
it
Anyway.
is. I think so.
Sounds right.
Yeah, it sounds right. Okay. So if people want to get involved, what should they do?
Yeah, so we have a few different entry points. So our application is Pump.science is the URL. And so they can go see for themselves all of the data that we've generated, all the tokens that have been launched, the performance of all of the above. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's the website. We have quite a large Twitter following, so X. So our X handle is pump.science, PUMPDOTSCIENC. And then we also have a Telegram channel as well, which you can find if you go to our X profile. But excuse me, X is where we do the vast majority of our communications, and that will kind of lead you to, the documentation, why we, started the project, why we made the design decisions we made. We have lots of podcasts also online if you're interested in, learning more about the story. But really, our goal is to get more people excited about crypto as a means for funding longevity research. We designed the system that we think is going to scale the best. We also do not assume that the decisions that we've made, which are super important, are the best decisions. And so we are certainly open to feedback and criticism, and we welcome that. And we certainly need more scientific talent that is, invested in the system working. And so I guess the call to action would really be to, come talk to us, share your opinions, criticize, and, consider participating in either some of the tokens that exist, or if you have an idea for a compound you want to test, submitting it on the site. We have a very easy form where anyone can submit an experiment. So if you want to get something tested, you can do it right on our website. It's completely permissionless. But yeah, thank you so much for the time. I hope you found the conversation interesting. I hope your audience does too.
It was, yes, Benji. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.